So the third leg of this that we want to talk about is really thinking outside the building. And we've got another great moderator for this, another member of the advisory committee for the conference, Sonny Popowsky, who now is at the Kleinman Center or is on the policy advisory board for the Kleinman Center at Penn, but also was the consumer advocate in Pennsylvania at the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission. So knows a little bit about how the whole system works and how people react to it as much as anything else. So with that, Sonny.
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks for inviting me to participate both in this program today and in the planning for this important event. As you heard, my name is Sonny Popowsky. I was the consumer advocate of Pennsylvania for many years, many decades, and now I'm associated with the Kleinman Center and several other nonprofit boards and organizations. The panel for this session is the role of energy efficiency in a deep decarbonization strategy for the future. I think anyone attending this conference, either here in person or in the web, on the web, I probably don't need to tell you about the benefits of energy efficiency, both in reducing emissions for the benefit of the environment, as well, from my perspective, the benefit of reducing costs for consumers. The question today that we're going to address today is how do we ensure that our energy efficiency programs are designed and implemented and measured in such a way that we can truly rely on those programs as a substantial component of our efforts to achieve deep decarbonization in the future. We have an excellent panel with three folks here today. Our lead presenter will be Inês Azevedo. She unfortunately wasn't able to be here today, but she is an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy, and her work is largely focused on environmental, technical, and technical challenges surrounding climate change and the need to establish a more sustainable energy system. Our second speaker, who ironically was able to get here from Colorado, is Matt Jungclaus, who is a senior associate at in the building practice program at the Rocky Mountain Institute, which was, of course, founded by Amory Lovins back in 1982. Matt is working on several important initiatives at RMI that target aggressive energy efficiency goals, including an important program here in Pittsburgh that he will be telling us about. And our third speaker will be, who will also be here on a virtual basis, is Sebastien Houde. Dr. Houde is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics, and his research focuses on investigating the policy tools that are used to manage energy demand, address climate change, and better design energy systems. So without further ado, I hope we'll be able to get Inês in just a few seconds.
Okay, I see Ron is asking me to speak a little bit louder. I'm as close as I can to the mic, so hopefully this will be okay, and I'll get started. Thank you so much, Sonny, for the introduction. So today I'll be talking a little bit about redefining energy efficiency for deep decarbonization and how to think outside the building. Next slide, please. So I'll start by discussing the need for energy efficiency and where does Pennsylvania stand in terms of both the spending and the achievements so far. And then I'll follow on a discussion on will indeed energy efficiency deliver, and what are the sorts of tools, analysis, and assessments that may be needed to understand whether the policies and incentives that are being implemented are achieving the intended goals. And finally, I'll suggest that we can start thinking about, in Pennsylvania and more broadly in the United States, about what will be the next generation of energy efficiency mitigation strategies that will be needed for deep decarbonization. And I'll provide an example with one suggested alternative that we can start to consider. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the need for energy efficiency. Next slide. And the motivation has developed already during the rest of the day, but energy services currently are the largest contributor to greenhouse gases, with electricity accounting for roughly 30% of the emissions and transportation for another 30%, with transportation recently surpassing the emissions from electricity. But pursuing energy efficiency strategies, namely in what pertains electricity, becomes really a no-brainer given that the large set of options that one can deploy in ways that can reduce costs to consumers while at the same time reducing greenhouse gases. Next slide. The issue of focusing on energy efficiency strategies and policies has been stressed over the years. This is just one of the many examples from the EIA that shows a portfolio of strategies that would need to be deployed to achieve the 450 ppm. And the area that you see in the bright yellow corresponds to the goals for energy efficiency. This to say that without energy efficiency, we are very unlikely to get there, but also that these sorts of plots may be overly optimistic. So if you look at the figures from the EIA, the goal over here would be that by 2020, energy efficiency will deliver 72% of the intended emissions reductions, and by 2035, 44%. So enormous numbers. Next slide. At the same time, when we think about the energy efficiency and the benefits from it, in the United States particularly, this makes sense given that the grid is old and still heavily reliant on coal, and there's the large amount of emissions. But it's also worthwhile to note that whereas I would provide this same slide and saying just that the grid was old and dirty, right now, over the course of the last 5-6 years, we see dramatic changes also on the type of capacity installed. Next slide. In particular, we see that there were very substantial capacity additions and retirements. The slide at the top is showing the current capacity installed that we see across our generation based on the first year of its operation. And so we see coal coming in around the 70s and then a peak in natural gas generation in the early 2000s. The plot at the bottom breaks down for the most recent years the types of capacity additions and retirements that we've been observing. And so you see a large increase with about 60% of the additions being from wind and solar in terms of capacity, and the remaining natural gas in 2016, and a large part of the retirements being coal-related. This to say that both geographically and temporally, the investment in a reduction of a kilowatt hour will have very different emissions reductions, and will continue to have very different emissions reductions as those are pursued. Next slide. This diversity is also observed regionally. So this slide was put together by Nathaniel Orner, one of my co-authors, and shows the carbon intensity in 2015 of the electricity generation by state by relying on EPA, SEMS data and EIA data on generation. And so using one single carbon intensity factor to see what we're getting from different energy efficiency interventions may be really misleading. Next slide. This is the case not only in what concerns CO2, and I know that this is indeed the focus of this meeting, but it's worthwhile pointing out that as we pursue energy efficiency strategies, the benefits that we'll get in terms of the health and environmental damages associated with criteria air pollutants avoided will also differ very substantially across the country. And so I would argue that we want to look at those two things at the same time, air quality and greenhouse gases. The map shows the health and environmental effects from one same ton of SO2 from point sources in different counties. And you see that those damages to health and the environment range from about $1,000 per ton of SO2 to $15,000 per ton of CO2, depending on how where the pollutant is issued, how it disperses, and in particular, how dense is the area, how densely populated is the area that is exposed to that pollution. Next slide. Now, there have been many studies over the last decades identifying what is the potential and cost effectiveness for energy efficiency strategies. This provides just one illustration from those bottom-up engineering studies, this one shown on the screen being from McKinsey. And you observe that all those things that are below the vertical axis are strategies that can be pursued at net savings to the consumers, while at the same time saving and reducing CO2 emissions, things like lighting and so on. This sort of characterization is out there and performed nationally. I would argue that we could also pursue a very detailed assessment of such bottom-up engineering economic studies for Pennsylvania as a starting point. And that would be a first step. But more than that, the question is, okay, if there are all those savings, why aren't people pursuing them? And if they do pursue them, are those strategies indeed delivering the intended savings? Next slide. So I'll spend just a couple of slides describing where Pennsylvania stands and where does it stand comparatively to other states. And in the big picture, Pennsylvania has reinvented itself all over and over during the times, first with coal, then with the shale revolution. Next slide. And I would argue that the next step for consideration is whether Pennsylvania could also become the leader in energy efficiency. Next slide. In order to do so, a strategy in terms of budget allocation and spending in energy efficiency strategies is needed. This plot shows the utility-funded energy efficiency and demand-side management programs back in 2010, and it displays the top 10 states in terms of spending both for electricity and natural gas in the first sets of numbers, and then just for electricity or just for natural gas in the third and in the second and third sets of numbers. And unfortunately, Pennsylvania is not in this list, as you can observe. And whereas the funding from California is now or was back in 2010 of more than $1 billion for electricity and natural gas. We'll see the numbers for Pennsylvania in just a little bit. Next slide. So I looked up the recent numbers from 2015 for both California and Pennsylvania. In 2015, California spent $1.38 billion in electricity alone, electricity energy efficiency programs. And this corresponded to about 3.4% of the statewide utility revenues. And it also spent $337 million in natural gas energy efficiency programs, corresponding roughly to $32 per customer. In Pennsylvania, we have spent $217 million in electricity energy efficiency programs. So about 1/3 of the statewide utility revenues compared to California. And we've spent only $12 million in natural gas energy efficiency programs, or $5 per customer. So ramping up these sorts of activities should be a priority if deep decarbonization is to be taken seriously. Next slide. Finally, are we going to achieve energy efficiency for deep decarbonization? Next slide. I would argue that in order to get us there, we need to address and develop a detailed research and policy implementation agenda that in a structured way will address the following questions. First, to identify what's the techno-economic potential that we are going to see for Pennsylvania, with analysis that determine the current stock of buildings and equipment and understand the pace of change that is occurring naturally right now. Second, we've been performing some of that work at Carnegie Mellon at the national level. A few years back, we developed a tool with a user interface that allows to assess the energy efficiency potential for different regions in the U.S. residential sector. We look both at the economic costs and greenhouse gas savings from different types of energy efficiency appliances and equipment. But also, this tool explicitly looks at the trade-offs between different indicators, meaning what would be the savings in terms of electricity, CO2, primary energy costs, and also damages from criteria air pollutants. This is called the regional residential energy efficiency model. And if you click on to the next slide, user interface will appear. So the modeler or the decision maker can look at the energy efficiency supply curves for different years of analysis, for different regions, different types of fuels and end users, and it produces those efficiency supply curves in the perspective of consumers when making decisions between which appliances to buy and the CO2 emission savings that they are derived, utilities or regulatory agencies. If you move to the next slide, one of the outputs of the model will show up. So this is for the entire nation and showing the cost effectiveness potential for different types of strategies. Each point along those curves will represent one specific strategy, like, for example, lighting in New England for a segment of the stock. And so we observed that there is about a 30% reduction in total emissions that could be achieved at net savings to the consumers. Next slide. So I already iterated that a starting point would be to perform the techno-economic potential using this sort of bottom-up analysis. And if you click again to the next slide, the second point would be that when we have a good sense of what this techno-economic potential is, to think about whether the techno-economic potential can be achieved and what is the role of different types of policy mechanisms and incentives in terms of providing and helping with those goals being met. To achieve that, there is really the need for the design of randomized controlled trials, but also to make use of natural experiments where we can use data from smart meters and understand program enrollment and outcomes as a function of that. And Sebastien Houde, in one of the next speakers, will tell a little bit more about this. Next slide. When thinking about whether those energy efficiency goals are going to be achieved as we pursue policies, one of the aspects of the discussions that comes to mind very often is the issue of rebound effect. So every 10 years or so, we see again the discussion on rebound effects, meaning is it worthwhile to invest in energy efficiency, given that all those savings are potentially eroded and demand will just continue to grow. Our group has paid some attention to this issue. Next slide. Where we have first and foremost discovered that the different disciplines and different researchers would use tremendously different definitions and scopes of analysis when thinking about the rebound effects, meaning across experimental psychologists, economists, and engineers, the definitions of rebound effects could range from just leaving the lights on after implementing more efficient lighting technologies to having a full life cycle scope. So we started by producing a review report and a series of papers on just developing the taxonomy and mapping out the taxonomy that is used in different fields. And then we decided to also run our own simulations about how bad could this problem be. So if you click in the next slide, our starting point was to understand what is the average carbon footprint for people in different states. So you'll see in the different bars for the this is for the top 25 states, and if you click to the next slide, you'll see the next 25. What the bars are showing are the overall life cycle carbon footprints for households. So this is not only the direct emissions from gasoline and natural gas, but also the upstream emissions from electricity and the upstream emissions associated with other consumptions such as food and so on. So the total height of the bars corresponds to the carbon footprint for those households. And we see that Pennsylvania is not mapping too poorly in this map. It's actually on the lower 25 states, but it could obviously do better. So the first thing that we mapped is this issue of a baseline on how much are the households in different locations emitted. While I'm not showing that, we also did the same exercise, but for different income levels and so on. The second part of this question now is how bad can rebound get? So what we've done is to perform a simulation assuming that an energy efficiency intervention that will save 10% in an electricity bill or in natural gas or in gasoline would be pursued. And then through using consumer expenditure surveys and information on people's own price and income and substitution elasticities, mapped out how those savings would be respent. So if you click on the next slide, what we're showing over here, this is again first for the top 25 slides, and then if you click again, Pennsylvania is going to show up and being highlighted. What you're seeing in these plots are in the white bars with the dashed lines, the effective savings that occurred after the efficiency intervention, and the tiny little bars are the penalty from rebound effects. This is not totally unsurprising. If we're pursuing energy efficiency strategies in electricity where the carbon intensity is high, even if you respend the entire money from those savings in other things, those other things, unless you spend the entire money on gasoline, are likely to be less carbon intensive than what you're doing in the first place. But of course, the location matters, and the carbon intensity of where you are matters. And you can see that because the grid from California will have a lower carbon intensity, California is at the bottom end with a very tiny rebound effect. This is the rebound effect in tons of CO2 per year. But if you click next, the literature in the next slide, the literature generally shows rebound effects in percentage terms, which is highly misleading because they will divert from the baseline that you're looking at. So if you see in this case, California has the highest rebound effect in percentage terms, despite the fact that we just observed that it has the smallest in terms of actual tons of CO2 that are going to be emitted as a result of rebound. And for Pennsylvania, we see that the rebound effect will be less than 20%, meaning energy efficiency will have some penalty, but some of the savings would still be arising. Next slide. So though we found that the simulated rebound effects are generally quite modest, this is not always the case, and the policy design may have some unintended consequences. Next slide. For example, using data from PG&E through the Wharton Customer Analytics, we assessed what was the effect on energy consumption from a rebate program for appliances. The way we did this was through the use of smart meter data. So we had 30,000 customers from 2008 to 2011, for which we had 15-minute interval readings. The data set also included program participation by the households on different types of programs, not only the rebate programs, but also low-income rates, smart AC, and so on and so forth. And it included the household location. We appended to this data demographic information at the census block so that we would be able to pair and control for census block level income, median home value, and so on. And we also paired up to that data set daily temperature data so that we could control for weather-related loads. Next slide. The results were extremely surprising. So on average, instead of a decrease, we observed an increase in electricity consumption after the household applied for the rebate. What you're seeing in the plot is that if we don't control for other programs' participations and we just see what happens as people participate in the rebate program, electricity consumption increases on average by 6%. When we control for the effects of all the other programs, we actually find that the household electricity consumption increases by 7%. So this is due to two things. It's either an increase in demand because people didn't have the appliance in the first place and were buying a new appliance, or, and importantly, because they kept the old appliance as they bought the new one. Indeed, if you click on the next slide, for those programs where the recycling or scraping of the old appliance was mandatory, we see that the average electricity consumption actually decreased by 6.4%, as was intended in the goals of the policy. So implementing a recycling and scrapage program would help with the policy achieving the intended goals. Finally, as we think about deep decarbonization, we may want to start thinking outside the building. Next slide. And next one. So one could start thinking about novel strategies such as, well, we all like to watch our Netflix and Hulu movies and shows. To provide that service, we have data centers that have that information and that is replicated in many data centers around the country, and that is feeding us our load. Would there be a strategy with some flexibility given the network associated with the content distribution providers to reduce emissions by just selecting which data centers provide the loads when and when? Next slide. This is novel in the sense that traditional technologies may shift the load over time, as it is the case in the demand response, and data center networks can shift the load in space. And so given the need for deep decarbonization, we may start to think about some of those strategies today. Next slide. So the way these things operate in terms of us having our movie on time is that content distribution networks optimize the delivery of the web content to us. So we have different types of content providers that provide web pages, business applications, videos, games, and so on. All of those are going to be using large CDNs, and those CDNs are going to have data centers located in different places across the country, and they're going to use a global load balancing algorithm to be able to use that network and provide us, the users, with that content. Next slide. So there is an energy associated with having that information. So the energy associated with providing 1 gigabyte of information may be roughly 0.01 kilowatt hours. And there is uncertainty in this number. But so we take this information and use actual data from one content distribution provider with both the flows that they had observed, the demands at different loads, and the details on their network infrastructure. And we ask the following questions. First, could they save money by using different load meeting strategies? Could they save money if they were moving from flat rates to dynamic pricing? And finally, how much could they save in terms of emissions if we wanted to maximize emission savings instead of minimizing the operating costs? And then strategies in between. Next slide. So as inputs in this strategy are the actual data on load demand from a large CDN, to which we append electricity prices, both retail prices and LMP data. And finally, we use also health, environmental, and climate change damages associated with different balancing areas, EGRID and NERC regions across the country. And we look at what happens when we either minimize just the private costs, the external damages, or both. We do take into account node capacities, bandwidth limits, and take also into account to limit the latency associated with providing the energy service. Next slide. Okay, so what you see in the first bar is the status quo for these CDN. What are their electricity bills and the health damages associated with the current operations? So the electricity bills from the CDN are a little bit less than $50 million, and their operations over the course of a year are associated with almost $30 million in health and environmental and climate change damages. Next slide. Now, if we run our algorithm with all the constraints that are there in the system, we observe that the CDN could reduce its operating costs by close to 25%. So this is fairly large by just using rerouting strategies. But this will lead to an increase in emissions of 2 to 10%. Next slide. If instead the CDN decides to try to use dynamic pricing and rely on LMPs, and we didn't use the pure LMPs and added several add-ons to account for transmission and distribution costs too, but we observed that we would gain a little bit more in terms of the energy savings too, so just reducing that by 30%. So this is all strategies that are on the win side for the CDN, but that don't necessarily help us with the emissions. Next slide. Now, as a planner, one may take into account that you may have the objective of reducing emissions as the primary goal. And if you were to do so, you'd be able to reduce the overall emissions from the CDN by 40%. And then, though I'm not showing in the slide, we basically did a multi-attribute assessment with the two objectives, both the reduction in costs and the damages, and understood and tried to map out the different tipping points for each. Next slide. So overall, this was a lot of material with different examples, but in a nutshell, we do need energy efficiency to achieve deep decarbonization. I do think that Pennsylvania could position itself as one of the U.S. energy efficiency leaders across the country and potentially globally with a well-thought strategy. But in order to do so, we need to continue the efforts that are already ongoing by the existing institutions, but even more to think about partnerships with the universities and to think about research and policy implementation agendas that would address the following questions. First, what's the techno-economic potential for energy efficiency in Pennsylvania? What are the technologies and strategies that Pennsylvania is especially well positioned to pursue? And what are the barriers that may prevent Pennsylvania to achieve energy efficiency goals? To understand whether the techno-economic potential will be achieved and if there are any unintended consequences arising from some policy designs. And finally, I'll end the way Sonny started, actually, that the data that we have today from smart meters and so on will enable us to do big data analytics on whether those programs are being successful, and that should be a top priority. And with that, I'll end. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Inês and Sonny, for the great introduction and great first presentation. My name is Matt Jungclaus. I am a senior associate from Rocky Mountain Institute, again, based in Boulder, Colorado, where it is 75 and sunny right now. So I was a little hesitant to get on that plane, but very happy to be here and excited to be in front of you all today. Actually, it looks like my presentation is not up here right now. I can wing it if we need to. Okay. That's okay. But I can start while we're loading things up by talking a bit about Rocky Mountain Institute and what we do, for those of you who are unfamiliar. Our saying is that we are seeking to basically transform our global energy use for a clean, prosperous, and secure energy future. It's a bit of a broad phrase, but we cover a lot at RMI, really. As Sonny mentioned, we started in the 80s through the leadership of Amory Lovins, and over the years we've gone through a few different iterations in terms of what we do, but right now we have a building efficiency practice, which I'm focused on, and several areas that focus on the electricity sector, transportation, among a number of other things. Now, in buildings, we focus on a few different things. My area of expertise is really on deep efficiency, net zero energy, basically offsetting your entire site's energy consumption from on or off-site renewables. But we see that there's a big issue in existing buildings. We have an area that focuses more on kind of the mass deployment of efficiency measures. One of the big issues with efficiency is the cost effectiveness after you get beyond about 30% savings or so. So that initiative is really focused on kind of hitting the sweet spot of ROI so that commercial developers will invest in efficiency beyond, just kind of skimming the cream off the top, going for light efficiency with things like just LEDs and other light measures. We also have a residential practice that's focused on a few things, including kind of a manufactured solution for driving efficiency through building retrofits in that sector. I can also jump into some of the slide content we'll have hopefully in just a minute here. No. Going on the fly. So, my presentation sits a bit on top of some of the other things we're talking about in terms of efficiency and gets out to, kind of the overall issue of where buildings fit into the entire system.
I don't have it here, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I can keep going without a presentation if
Doing
that's...
awesome.
Okay, I'll keep going. Eyes off the screen, everyone. This is all we're getting. So, talking about why buildings actually matter is the main focus of my presentation, and I'm going to dive a bit into a specific project we're working on in Pittsburgh, actually, focused on net zero energy and some of the deep savings tactics that we're focused on at RMI in our Pathways to Zero initiative. So why do buildings actually matter? We spend about 90% of our time in buildings, whether it's at work or at home, you're sleeping, whatever it might be, and yet it's one of the last areas that people want to invest in. And in reality, a lot of times, we realize that our homes are drafty, or that we don't like the lighting, or we don't like the temperature in the rooms that we're in. I've seen some people go for the sweater in this room. And really focusing on some of those human factors can drive us to enjoy the places that we live in more than anything. Additionally, buildings account, you've heard a lot of these statistics already, for I think 39% of total emissions in the United States. That's in addition to industry and transportation. So more than 1/3 of our total energy use. But buildings account for about 75% of the electricity on the grid, which is really, really incredibly substantial in an area not worth looking over. A 2009 McKinsey study also found that just by looking at net present value positive savings opportunities in buildings, so things that are paying back probably in the 3 to 5 year range, there's an opportunity to save about 30% of our total energy. A few years later, we did a follow-up analysis that put that number closer to 40%, and you can see that number rising with things like the falling cost of LEDs and the instrumentation of buildings in many other ways. So I'm going to focus on 3 kind of key drivers that I see in pushing efficiency and why that matters. The first one is really a global call to reduce emissions. I won't harp on COP21, the call to reduce global emissions. I know that there are a lot of questions as to whether we'll continue to support that. I know that at the federal level, there's a desire to get out of our agreement to COP21, but the agreement goes a lot farther than just the federal government. There are a number of businesses that committed at COP21 and a lot of state and local areas that are really focused on maintaining that commitment and further driving savings and decarbonizing the grid, our buildings, et cetera, in support of that. And on that state and local level, we have over 10 localities that have committed to some form of carbon neutrality, sourcing all of their energy from renewables over the next 20 years or so. And in addition to that, there are tons of other localities, Pittsburgh included, that have laws on the books around disclosure, around efficiency. We've recently done some work with New York City that's really moving the ball forward in terms of reducing their own emissions toward an 80% reduction in 2050, which is really tremendous. So you're seeing a lot of support at that smaller scale. And in addition to that, we're seeing businesses really commit, especially to distributed renewables. Over 7 gigawatts of installed renewable capacity from announced PPAs in wind and solar on and off site from some of the big Fortune 500s, Google, Facebook, IBM, and others kind of leading the way in that area. So that first key driver is a global call, not just at the political level, but also looking at business, also going to state and local governments as opposed to just federal governments. The second key driver that I see is a fundamental shift in the way that our electric grid is operating. In the 20th century, the grid was largely looking at growing demand to increase the amount of customers that they can focus on, looking at an economy of scale in terms of offering service to their customers and, again, increasing that number of kilowatt hours sold so that they could increase profit margins, things along those lines. And in the 21st century, we're really seeing a difference in that. We're seeing a desire to reduce demand so that we can work within the constraints of the utility industry that we have today in terms of grid infrastructure. If we can work with what we have, we can significantly reduce operating costs over the long term, not lean as heavily on some of our more flexible loads or on bringing more generation online while we're trying to transition to a clean energy future. There's also this interesting point of an instrumentation that's kind of consumer-led in buildings. We see things like the Deloitte's Edge building in Amsterdam. If you haven't looked it up, it's really interesting, heavily instrumented, achieving net zero energy, albeit not with the most efficiency possible in the building. But people are really interested in it because they can interact with it. They can do things with their smartphones, their tablets, all over the place, talking about their interaction with the space and allowing them to customize the areas that they're in. So it's this instrumentation that allows a two-way communication with the grid. It makes buildings a grid asset and allows them to basically interact with the utility in a way that can be profitable for both. So that fundamental shift is critical. There are a number of specifics on the slide related to business models and new financing mechanisms and other things that are allowing these. But that second key factor is just really focused on the fundamental shift that we're seeing in the grid that's enabling buildings to play a greater role and communicate with the utility. The third piece is really related to value. And a lot of people, when they think of a building retrofit, they want to know how much money am I going to save? What does that look like in terms of the total cost of this retrofit? They look at those two factors, energy cost savings and the cost of the retrofit, and that's it. When it comes to working in corporate real estate, they're also looking at those two factors, more or less in isolation, looking for a 3 to 5 year payback, and often that's where the buck stops. And you often see retrofits fall short. They're 10 to 20% of savings from the baseline energy consumption. And, that's okay, but we know that there's a much greater potential if we can get to 30, 40, and what we've seen as achievable is 50 or 60% as a maximum in existing buildings. And if you look at a lot of the other factors, it starts with the tangible, like operations and maintenance savings, project development cost savings, tenant satisfaction. There's usually an increase in sales revenue by increasing the value of the building itself. You really start to build a better business case and something that can justify that 40, 50, 60% energy savings in a project rather than just cutting it at 10 or 20 and leaving it there. Now, there are some specifics related to value in a case study of a project we're working on here in Pittsburgh. It's a net zero energy development that's underway. And RMI was brought on as more or less a net zero energy master planner, you could think of us as. You can also read about this online if you Google RMI net zero energy districts. You can find the report and some of the diagrams I was going to have up there at that site. But there are a few key takeaways here. I mean, this was a 180-acre brownfield redevelopment site. It's barely broken ground here, so things are kind of still in flux. But the plan that we developed looked at the business case and the technical case in one and looked at all of those elements of value that I just brought up. We didn't touch the intangibles like occupant satisfaction and other things which have been studied and which have positive benefits but are tough to quantify. But we looked at the total cost of energy over the lifetime of the generating assets. We looked at the cost of efficiency. We looked at the ability to produce solar on site here in Pittsburgh. And the site is right along a river, which offers a really nice opportunity to exchange heat with that system. So the site is looking at very deep efficiency goals, more than 50% beyond existing code for new construction, looking at developing all of its energy on site and having this complex geothermal heating and cooling system that exchanges energy with the river. But in doing so, if you look at all of the value streams together and you combine them, you can create a business case that makes this either on par or slightly less expensive for developers on site. And it actually comes out at about business as usual in terms of energy costs for the tenants on site as well. So by having one entity, we look at this more or less as an on-site utility. We call them a district energy entity because they're involved from kind of the beginning of all of this. They're responsible not only for installing solar and installing the geothermal system, but operating these things. And they're in charge of making sure the buildings hit their efficiency targets. And one key is they're financing the additional cost of efficiency beyond a code-compliant building. Then over time, you have a customer who's paying for a much smaller amount of energy, paying for these other services, and they end up more or less coming out neutral in terms of their total costs to this utility for energy over time. So I'd love to talk about that and talk more about some of RMI's other involvements, but I will leave it at that for now and look forward to answering some questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. And I'm pretty sure that Matt's slides will be made available online for everybody who's here, because I assure you they do exist and they're very good. So.
Also impressive that he can do it without them.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. So, Sebastien.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me well? Yes. Okay. Okay, so very happy to be able to join you via the webinar. So in this short presentation, I want to make 2 points. So if we go on slide number 2. Okay, so the first point is that I want to make today is that the true energy savings from energy efficiency program have been notoriously hard to measure. It was true 30 years ago, it was true 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and this is still true today. So this is the bad news. But the good news is I think we are making good progress with data-driven evaluation approach. And here there are 2 key words that I will use in that that presentation is credible estimates. So why are we referring to estimates of energy efficiency programs? Well, as I will explain in a minute or two, we can never know with certainty the impact of an energy efficiency program. So we always need to approximate, measure with some statistical model energy efficiency program. And that is just a feature of that type of resource, okay? And because of that, we need to focus on having credible estimates. And here, credible, I define the term in three ways. First, a credible estimate is something that is based on assumptions that are defendable. Second, credible estimates are based, need to be based on assumption that if we relax, we still find robust results. And finally, credible estimates need to be such that if we share the data with other analysts, they will be able to find similar estimates to the one that we found with similar or the same data. Okay, so with those three ingredients of a good estimate, this is what we should be using or working with to measure the impact of energy efficiency program. So I think the way I see the debate in the energy efficiency policy arena, this is really where we should be focusing a lot of our effort, trying to understand what is the true impact of energy efficiency programs. And the second point that I want to make is that energy efficiency programs don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in markets, and market participants will respond in a strategic manner to energy efficiency program. So if we really want to understand the impact of those programs, we need to understand the strategic behavior of the market participants that are impacted by energy efficiency programs. And as I go along, you will see why this is so important. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me go a bit in more detail on the issue of evaluation measurement. So, unlike solar, wind, nuclear, those resources, we can simply measure the electrons going into the grid, and we know how much of the resource we have. The problem with energy efficiency, this is not the case. The energy efficiency resource are measured with so-called megawatts. What is the megawatts? Well, this is a measure of energy savings, and that measure of energy savings is based on a counterfactual. What is a counterfactual? Well, a what-if version of the world. So let me just define that in a simpler manner. So a megawatt will be measured as the energy use observed under a certain energy efficiency program. And we need to subtract to that the energy that would have been used without the energy efficiency program, holding everything else constant. So that second measure of energy use is not observed. This is our what-if version of the world. So, what we observe minus what would have been used is our megawatt. So why this is so hard to measure this, to create this what-if version of the world? Next slide, please. Well, there are four reasons that makes it hard to create credible counterfactual for energy efficiency program. So the first of those four reasons is that program participants select in energy efficiency program. So we cannot simply compare participant to non-participant to try to infer that alternative version of the world, because participant decided, presumably, to participate in the program based on some reasons, and non-participant presumably also decided to not participate for other reasons. And those two types of individuals, firms, program participants are very different. Okay, so we cannot simply compare participant to not participant. That is called the so-called selection problem in program evaluation. Okay, so suppose that even if, instead of you comparing participant to non-participant, what an alternative strategy to measure the energy savings of a given program might be to simply compare the behavior of participants before and after the implementation of an energy efficiency program. But here, the challenge in this context is that there are a lot of idiosyncratic events that affect energy use. And one of which that we know well these days is weather. And there's not only weather, anything that will impact your lifestyle, kids moving out of the house, shock to your building envelope of your building, so on and so forth. All those type of events will affect energy use over time, which will make it hard to compare or to assess the energy savings of a given participant just using time, before and after the program. Okay, but even if we were able to do so, even if we have, let's say, a good statistical model that can control for weather, this is still hard to measure or to control to construct a valid counterfactual, because program participants can respond to an energy efficiency program in various ways. Okay, so let me take the example of let's say a rebate program for appliances. A given program participants that decided to purchase a new appliance and claim a rebate might have substituted his purchase behavior, the timing of this purchase behavior over time. So maybe that person will, accelerated the replacement of his old appliance by a few months, or maybe by a few, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years. So the timing, to which extent that household substituted over time is hard to assess. But also, not only the timing might have been influenced by the rebate program, maybe the intensity of use, which Inês refers as the rebound effect. So maybe if you have a more efficient appliance, you decide to use a little bit more that appliance because it costs less to run it. And maybe also the rebate program, if generous enough, might induce some substitutions toward other type of products that are not only energy efficient, but have other features. So, simple example, let's go back to the rebate program. You might decide to purchase, if you have a $200 rebate, you might decide to go for a side-by-side refrigerator instead of a top freezer or a larger refrigerator, because now you can afford that with the rebate. Okay, so all those strategic behavior, all those substitutions will impact the energy use, and it makes it hard to know what will have happened in a world without rebate. Okay, so if we observe a given individual that claim a given rebate, how can we know that household accelerated the replacement of his old appliance by 3 months, 2 years, or 5 years? Really hard to assess. And finally, not only program participants will respond in a strategic manner to energy efficiency program, but also all other market participants. So if we go back to the rebate program again, if a state, let's say Pennsylvania has a really generous rebate program for dishwashers or clothes washers, then retailers and manufacturers might respond strategically to that rebate program. So you might see a change in product offering, pricing, marketing for those programs. So now, if we want to assess the true energy savings of that program, we need also to understand the strategic response to the retailer and manufacturers to that rebate program. Okay? So because of those 4 reasons, 4 elements, this is pretty hard to construct valid counterfactual for energy efficiency program. And now the question is, does it matter in practice? So if we go to the next slide, the answer seems to be yes. So here I've listed a number of papers, but there is a debate now, I would say now, it has been around for a while, but if you look at the ex ante estimate of energy savings of energy efficiency program, so what are ex ante estimates? Those are the ones that try to predict how much energy will be saved by a given measure. If you compare those estimates to the one that look back, the ex-post estimates, so those ex-post estimates were computed by collecting data on existing energy efficiency program, and using a variety of statistical technique, they try to estimate how much energy were really saved. But if you compare the ex ante to ex post estimates, they tend to not be the same. And in fact, the ex post estimate tend to be a bit smaller on average. Okay, so it seems that ex ante, which seems to predict larger savings than what we really achieve with energy efficiency program. So I should say that, this is a debate. I've seen papers where ex ante savings are smaller than ex post, but on average, in the literature, at least recently, we see that the ex post savings tend to be smaller. And then if you look at different papers that have done this exercise to do that ex post evaluation, there are a number of reasons why this is the case. So quickly, some papers have found that the proportion of free riders, so what are the free riders? Those are the program participants that claim or take advantage of energy efficiency programs, but in the absence of an energy efficiency programs, their behavior would have been pretty much the same. Okay. So ex post analysis tend to estimate that the proportion of free riders is much higher than what ex ante analysis or estimates will predict. And there are other papers that found that actually program participants tend to substitute toward products that differ not only in the energy dimension, but also in the non-energy dimension. So 2 papers that I've listed there show that, if you offer rebates to consumers, they tend not only to go for more energy efficient product, but they tend also to go to larger product. And so those larger products undo some of the savings that were predicted ex ante from that rebate program. Some rebate, the rebound effect exists. The size of it is debated, as Inês pointed out. And there are other sort of substitution also that is happening because of energy efficiency program. So let me, I don't want to go too much in the detail of those papers, but all of those papers, one thing that they have in common, they all use data-driven approaches trying to measure ex post what was the savings. And the exercise, go one step further. They also try to understand what was the behavior of the program participant or market participant that were affected by the energy efficiency programs. So if we go to the next slides, let me tell you a bit more about the techniques or methods that are being used to construct ex post estimate. So the ideal scenario is that, and actually I should say that none of the paper that I've listed in the previous slide use that ideal scenario, but the ideal scenario, if we want to create a really credible estimate of energy savings, well, we should run a perfect experiment. And what would be that perfect experiment? Well, suppose that we have a target population that we know that this is the population that will be targeted for a given energy efficiency program. Well, we should randomly select X% of that population, where the size of X% should be based on some statistical arguments so that we have enough precision in our measurement. So we'll select, let's say, 50%, 25%, 40% of the population randomly. It's really important that we do that randomly. And then we'll allocate, I would say, version A of the energy efficiency program. And then for the remaining of the population, we'll allocate version B of the program. And then we'll collect data on various outcome variables. Suppose that natural gas or electricity use is the only thing we care about. We'll collect data on that and compare electricity use under version A to electricity use under version B. And the difference between those 2 versions would be the causal impact of version A versus version B. So that is the ideal scenario to have the most credible assumption-free estimate of energy saving of a given energy efficiency program. The problem with that approach is this is not always possible, and this is hard. It takes time to run experiments. Okay, so nowadays we see more and more utilities, local government, nonprofit running those experiments in the energy efficiency domain, but still, it suffers a bit from the, let's investigate under the NAM post what we can do, because some programs we cannot randomize, or sometimes program manager are not also willing to randomize. So is there an alternative scenario, alternative approach that we can use that would get us close to an experiment? And the answer is yes. And all the papers that I've referred in the previous slide use some sort of quasi-randomization. So they use quasi-experimental approach to measure the impact ex post of energy efficiency program. And here the idea is to use different features of a program, variation over time, for instance, sharp cutoff in the eligibility criteria is another example, to try to create a valid comparison group to the participant that enroll in a given energy efficiency program. Okay, those quasi-experimental approach, they require assumptions to be valid, but those assumptions sometimes can be tested, they can be demonstrated, and also you can relax them and see how much whether your estimates would be robust to relaxing those assumptions. Okay, so those quasi-experimental approaches have the ingredients of a credible estimates because they are, they have clear assumptions that can be defended, they can be tested, and they can be relaxed. And the idea also is that they are simple enough that if you give the data to someone else, another analyst, it would be able to replicate your finding, and so see if whether or not you have a good estimate of the energy efficiency program that you are looking at. So that is what I would call, if you cannot run an experiment, just do that approach. Or, even if you run an experiment, it doesn't hurt to try to also use those type of approaches. And finally, in some cases, you don't have data. You are looking to a brand new program that have never been implemented before. It's not possible to do an experiment. So then you are left with, finding other ways to measure the impact of the program. And here I will argue that there is a big role for model. And here we should be, pretty careful how we model things, but we should think carefully about the strategic behavior that we expect to see under that type of program. Try to model those behavior and carefully calibrate the model and see, the range of response that the program will induce. So those are what I see. There's a gradient of credibility that I see here, where the experiment is the most credible approach. But those three approaches are all data-driven and should be used to study energy, the savings, to measure the savings of energy efficiency programs. Okay, so this is, what I wanted to say today. So let me just, wrap up that I really think that energy efficiency has a big role to play in the decarbonization of the electricity grid. But the challenge is that unlike other resources, energy efficiency measures is not 1 or 2 or 10 type of measures. This is hundreds, thousands of different type of measures. And each of them are very different. So without good and credible evaluation and measurement strategy, we'll be left in the dark. We'll not know what is working and what is not working. So this is really important that right at the onset, at the beginning of designing a program, we think about evaluation and measurement strategies. And let me just, I know that there are practitioners attending and listening now. My experience as a researcher is, when you go and try to convince utilities, government to give data to do an ex post evaluation, understand why there's a pushback. Because nobody likes to see, their program being shown to not work as it was planned or as they reported in, using other methods or using other sources. So I understand the pushback, on ex post evaluation. But what is frustrating for me as a researcher is when you reach out to program designer before a program is implemented, and there's a pushback on implementing good and credible evaluation measure right at the onset to try to build those strategies in the program. And I really think that for energy efficiency should be just part of the game, and any good energy efficiency program should really focus on having E&M, evaluation and measurement, built in the program as soon as the design is started. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say. Thank you, and looking forward for the questions.
Okay, thanks. We have time for maybe one or two questions. I would just add on Inês's point about the rebate without recycling. We do have a program here in Pennsylvania, which I think is pretty popular, which is that you can get your utility to come to your house and they'll pay you $50 for your old refrigerator in your basement or garage, which makes a lot more sense than what I tell consumers is you put a six-pack of beer in that refrigerator in your basement. It's the most expensive six-pack of beer you ever bought. It's about $150 a year. So anyway, Bobby?
Yeah, Bobby McKinstry. One of the problems I see with some of the research analyses and the current designs of a lot of energy efficiency programs is energy efficiency in and of itself isn't good unless it's aimed at the externalities, i.e. particularly carbon emissions. And I'll use my own example in Act 129. I put in a geothermal system where I eliminated 3,000 gallons of oil a year. That's not measured. I got more inefficient. Now I've added a plug-in hybrid where I've eliminated how much gas. I've gotten more inefficient according to my Act 129 measures. And a lot of the research design that I'm looking at is not looking at substitution. Electricity is going to be much more efficient in terms of carbon emissions than direct burning of oil or gas and internal combustion engines. And I'd appreciate your thoughts on what would be a better policy design.
Sorry, just for a little clarity, better policy design, so you're saying so that we can orient our policies toward including the benefits of moving toward more electricity and getting rid of the more carbon-intensive fossil fuels. Yeah, it's...
Because my emissions have reduced dramatically, yet I'm apparently more inefficient.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's something we constantly struggle with in terms of, often it's actually the consumer that doesn't understand that, and you're more of the super consumer that does understand that. I think that a lot of policies are really oriented toward, helping folks understand that the balances of these different numbers on their bill are going down, and that's helpful rather than seeing the transition from one fuel stream to another. I've seen a few interesting proposals around this idea that have looked at, if you're familiar with the term EUI, energy use intensity, it's a way to measure the efficiency of a building in terms of energy consumption per square foot per year, and helps you get a baseline across different building types. I've seen some proposals along the lines of looking specifically at a fossil fuel EUI that only measures the fossil fuels burned directly on site. I think that's helpful in some localities. The additional confounding factor is in some areas your grid is so dirty that there may be some question there about reducing one fuel versus another. So I think it's a good question. I think some of these new things that look at fossil fuel EUI or possibly an emissions-based EUI could be helpful.
I think Inês has a response.
Yes, to address that question, indeed, the most effective design would be the one that is tailored at avoiding the negative externalities associated with the choices. I would argue both climate change and health and environmental damages could be part of that, and perhaps even extending more. I would note, and I would be happy to share that a couple of years ago, we actually did a paper and that provided a decision tool for the funding from utilities, under which cases it would make more sense and be more cost effective to use those funds for electricity and use efficiency, or to incentivize the adoption of hybrid or electric vehicles, and doing so under the considerations of the full life cycle carbon intensity and criteria damages the intensity also in a life cycle perspective of those two alternatives. Meaning at some point, as you decarbonize the grid, you're better off incentivizing the electrification of those vehicles rather than continuing to pursue electricity and use efficiency alone. But we're not there yet in most locations.
Question back there?
Yes, I have a question primarily for Matt, but other panelists as well, if they care to respond. You mentioned during your remarks some of the challenges specific to retrofitting. For those of us in this region, it is a critical issue. 38% of the homes were built before 1956 in the city alone, let alone the surrounding suburbs. It's very similar. So can you speak to another policy question, much like Bobby's? What have you seen around the country to be the most effective policies to overcome the barriers associated with retrofitting, particularly in residential? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a really difficult one. You know, RMI focuses a lot on some of the market levers that we can pull in these areas, but we have seen some really interesting things. The issue is that once you are talking about what's effective, sometimes what's effective in terms of saving the energy is not always what's fair to all of the consumers out there. One thing that we have seen that's being implemented to a small degree in some cities and being considered in others is a point of sale energy retrofit requirement. We've seen sometimes that this is based on total energy performance, sometimes based on other factors, but the main idea being when a building is bought or sold, it has to exceed the current energy code. Some places are considering a trajectory toward net zero. I think those can be effective. I think, again, once you get above and beyond, 30% energy savings, you get into a point where it might not be cost effective for the consumer. But if you take the whole systems approach and consider things like the increased tax revenues that a city might see from additional construction from a policy like that, or things along those lines, those can be fed into incentives that then fund the program. So I'd say point of sale is a good example of something that can really move the needle, but would be happy to talk one-on-one about other examples later.
Is that it? I think we're done. So please join me in thanking our panelists.